everybody, first of all. Thank you so much for coming. Scott Baker is here, Jane Bloomer is here. They've both been involved with public banking. My name is Nada, and I've been working for Westpac, which is a local social justice organization it's a 42-year-old social justice organization. I've been working full-time for Westpac for the past 15 years. And before we start, before I invite Jane to come up and give her brief presentation, I thought we would go around the room just to see who's here, starting with Rachel.
I'm Rachel Estroff. At the moment, I work for Assemblymember Shelley Mayer, so I'm here in that capacity. Before that, I did organizing myself, so my heart is involved with this.
All right, and then Scott, I guess we'll introduce you. Well, why don't you say briefly about yourself?
Okay, well, I'm Scott Baker. I've been with the Public Banking Institute for about 6 years. I'm the New York coordinator and also senior advisor for the Institute. And lately I've been doing a lot of contract work setting up public banks in theory for different cities and states all across the country. I guess I've done over a dozen so far. We're talking about White Plains, and I'll use Oakland as a model today, but I'll get into all that when we get there.
Wonderful. And so now I'd like to introduce you all to Jane Bloomer. She's been involved with Westpac for several years now. And she recently did a radio interview with Milagros, who's a White Plains City Council member. And they had Scott on the air as well. And so this is the follow-up from the radio interview, so thank you.
Welcome everyone, I'm delighted to be here, and I'm glad I have so many friends. I wish I had more, but people that don't know me, I hope to get to know you better. I am a social worker. I've been a social worker for all of my career in various capacities. So I've seen how money affects both my wealthy clients and my middle income clients and my people that are indigent or on welfare. So I know that there are people here who know their American history better than I. So I'm going to, but I would like you all to help me with doing some thinking. I'd like to ask, I have a little quick quiz. I'd like to ask you, what American leaders or presidents influenced the United States money system and public banking?
Woodrow Wilson with the establishment of the Federal Reserve at the behest of the robber barons.
Okay, yes, and it was J.P. Morgan and John Rockefeller who were the geniuses behind the Federal Reserve
And the
System.
privatization of the bullion, the gold bullion, which became transferred ownership from the federal government to the private bank, which is the Federal Reserve, and began the whole process of privatization.
Beautifully said. Who else would like to share?
I would sing it, but Alexander Hamilton,
Why? Can you want to say
First
why?
Secretary of the
Can you
Treasury.
speak to them?
First Secretary of the Treasury.
And what did he do?
He sort of figured out what the system was going to be. I mean, he was the founding father that created our initial money system. Of course, it's changed a lot.
He certainly did. Let's see. Anybody, let's see, I would like to add, one second, I would like to add that he had the genius to see that debt could be turned into money that could fund the payment of the debts incurred from the Revolutionary War. He had the genius to see that the debt could also be used to monetize loans for the bakers and and cobblers and so on who wanted to start little businesses. And also it funded the colonies, the new prospective states, building of roads and bridges. Very good. Who else would like to add someone that they know better? How about Abe Lincoln? What did he do? He had a public banking system. Does anybody you remember the term greenbacks from high school?
Yeah, well, that's one of the reasons why they didn't want him anymore, because he was printing US currency.
Uh-huh.
And you're not supposed to print US currency. They had a red seal on it. I think he printed $400 million of US notes. And you know what happened to him.
You mean instead of going to the Federal Reserve?
Not Federal Reserve notes.
These
He
were-
printed US notes.
They come from Treasury.
So the idea of printing money, the Constitution says that the government is only allowed to print to do coins. And it is
Not
the
really.
banks that print the money. It is the
Not
banks
true.
that supply the money. You're
You can
absolutely
print
right.
paper money too. You can do paper money too. There were a series of court cases about that. The legal tender cases, and the last one, Juilliard versus Greenman, said, the Supreme Court said that the United States could print paper money. Was allowed to.
And it was Ben Franklin who was the father of paper money. So the ideas of the money system goes back quite a way. Has anybody heard of the Continental? It was the
Not
notes
worth a
that were
Continental.
used, huh?
Not worth a continental.
Not worth a
That
Continental.
was
Who
the
said
paper
that?
money up there.
Yeah, and what it was because the money that was printed to pay for the Revolutionary War ultimately was mistreated by the speculators, and there was a huge, big panic, and so the money became not worth the Continental. Okay, and what about good old FDR? What did he have to do with the public money?
Took us off the gold standard.
Say that again, Oliver.
He took us off the gold standard.
He did, and what else did he do? What else did he do that affected public money? And what about he established the FDIC that protects has for a long time, protected our money in the savings bank.
There's no money in that.
Well, that's another issue. And let's see, all right, so we're all the way up to practically the present time. And so what do? The banks printed money to bail out the banks. But what about Main Street? Rather than talking about generally or abstractly about what a public bank is, I would like to share with you an actual model of a living, breathing public bank, the Bank of North Dakota. The Bank of North Dakota is owned by the citizens of North Dakota. All of the taxes that come into the state are put into the reserves in the state, and the money is used for the citizens. It is used for the infrastructure. It is used to provide loans to the local citizens. It provides low-cost loans to college students. It's an extraordinary model, and it is very successful. Believe me, it is probably an endangered species, because imagine if the public bank came to New York State with Wall Street here. There would be some major challenges that would arise. Right now, North Dakota is up on the Canadian border. We don't have to, Wall Street doesn't have to worry too much about them. The Dakota worry, of course, but it is, it's an important institution, and it was established in 1919 when a number of farmers who were being really strict-mined by the cost of paying for the interest on the cost of borrowing money for seeds, for fertilizer, for equipment to run their farms, decided to develop a party. And it came out of the populist movement, and they elected a governor, they elected a legislature who put into effect the Bank of North Dakota, and it has been highly successful. And perhaps there may be a naysayer in the group that will say, oh, well, they discovered oil and that's what makes them successful. They have been successful, they have been fiscally sound for all of the time that they have been in operation. So I urge you to take a gander at the website. And finally, before I bring my little talk to a conclusion, I would like to share, well, we do have an author with us, Scott Baker, who I'm sure will tell us about his book. But I would like to tell you about a marvelous history, accessible, called The Web of Debt by Ellen Brown. And it's beautifully written, sort of using the analogy of Alice from Kansas. And the other book, a current one, is The Public Banking Solution. This was written over 10 years ago, and this was within the last 2 or 3 years. She's an attorney, and she is a very clear-headed writer. And she was the founder of the Public Banking Institute, of which Scott will tell you more about. He's the head of the New York State chapter. And the website, if you want to sign up for the Public Banking Institute, is well worthwhile. Oh, and the final thing that I want to say is that, and this, through the Public Banking Institute, Scott brought this to the members of the Institute to everybody's attention. The municipal banking, an overview. And guess who sponsors this? The Ford Foundation. The only one of the major car makers that was not bailed out, I hasten to remind you. And they have established at the Roosevelt Institute a public bank project. And this material is by Carl Beitel. I do have a handout, and I wrote his name was Keith. His name is Carl today. And I have a handout that I can give you about that. So I wanted to just share with you the final quote. The Henry Ford, the same Henry Ford of the Foundation. It is well enough that people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system. For if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow. Now, where have we all been? And where are we going with the leadership of Nada Plater and those of us in the room who can use their leadership skills and their intellectual heart and mind to see what we can do in doing some kind of community work to rebuild this nation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'd like to introduce Scott Baker, who is the coordinator of the New York State Public Banking Institute, who has also written a book which is on the bib that I handed out, and he'll be telling you about that. And he's quite an amazing thinker, and he has figured out how to start a public bank using spreadsheets and Excel and things that those with accounting capacities in the room will very much appreciate. Thank you so much, Scott.
Thank you.
The recording is on, right? The recording
It's
is
on.
on.
Meenakshi, we didn't have a chance to hear about you.
Oh, no, I'm good.
Just introduce yourself, please.
Hi there, I'm Meenakshi. I'm Scott's wife. I'm supporting.
Great. All right, so you've heard the overview and how important it is to create a bank for the people, as Public Banking Institute puts it, a bank in the public interest. And now we're going to get into very specifics. So I have another slideshow which sort of comes before this, which talks about why to have a public bank and so forth, but this is beyond that. This is going to be the actual nuts and bolts of it. This slideshow is up on slideshare.net. You can actually search for public banking, and you'll find not only this one, but all the other ones that I've done up on under my account. And so you can review what I'm sure will be a fairly detailed presentation. Probably a lot to take in for 20 minutes. Okay, so what do we need to do first? Well, first of all, you have to realize that every city, county, state has a lot of assets. They say they're broke, but they're not. White Plains has 122 million in assets. I know because I looked at their comprehensive annual financial report, and so that's what it was last year. Now that's just the general revenues. They have, in addition to that, they have assets of about 120 million. So I'm going to take 11% of that to form the capital, and I'll explain the difference between capital and deposits in a minute. But first of all, you have to ascertain the available assets. That's going to form our capital, and that's going to form our deposits in two different pots. And then decide how big the bank should be in order to perform its functions. Well, that depends partly on the population of the area and what you want it to do. So I'm going to assume that's already established. But that will determine your fixed and your startup costs, which I'll also show you. And then finally, in the workbook, which I'm going to show you, there's a third spreadsheet. There's 3 overall. We're going to calculate and project the results, including return on equity, return on assets, profits, dividends, performance, operating ratio, loan loss ratios. And we'll project 8 years in our model bank. So this is a custom spreadsheet. It's based on a book called Money Basics by Christopher Moore, written in 2003, but it's still valid. And he basically had a chapter how to set up a bank, a simple bank. There's a short chapter. I adapted his spreadsheet, I modified it, I added 2 more. I made it work for a public bank with my wife's help. She used to be a banker. So this is what we're going to look at. Okay, so the first spreadsheet allows you to create a running total of all the assets in the area. So I'm doing this for Oakland actually, because that was what I created, the manual that is now online, also on SlideShare. And so Oakland is my example city. They have about 413,000 people. They have, this is all in thousands, so they have 844 million in the different assets that we could possibly use for a public bank, including the primary government and the component units. Well, every entity has components in addition to the primary government. They may have parking garages or airports or things like that. These are component units. So you add it all up, and notice I'm not taking any capital assets. I'm not taking any land. There's no buildings on here because you can't monetize those. So we're only taking things that you can reinvest. So it's cash and investments, it's equity and pooled cash, and it's equity in a treasurer's account. Often the treasurers have their own pot of money. And restricted assets, well, restricted by who, so we have to kind of talk about the law a little bit, but not here. And then other assets and so forth. And then there's proprietary fund financial statements. These are investment accounts. They're not pension funds, but they're other kinds of funds. So we can use those as well. But I'm actually not even going to use those. I'm going to use pension fund to create a capital base. So the pension fund had $507 million, $507,827 million. So I'm going to take 10% out of that, or roughly 50 million, and I'm going to use that for capital. Now, I have to explain this thing in red here because people get this wrong sometimes. But a bank has capital and it has deposits. These are 2 separate things. The capital is what it needs in order to start up, not only to pay the startup costs, but to have, so these are where the reserves come from. And so you'll see in the next spreadsheet where it lays out. But you have to have capital in a bank at all times. The deposits come and go. And you use the deposits, I want to say you use the deposits to make loans, but that's not exactly true. Actually, banks create money when they make loans. They created new, fresh money that wasn't there, but they have to have the deposit in order to create the loan. So it's a little bit confusing, but the banks actually create a deposit whenever they make a loan, but they can't create more in loans than they have on deposit. So that's the restriction. So a bank can leverage capital, but it can't leverage deposits. So what this means is we can have 50 million in capital, which we're going to have, but in order to really be able to lend as much as possible under the rules, you can have up to 9 times the capital. So you can have, say, 400 million, which I'm going to have from the general revenues. So that's that. All right, so now the second spreadsheet tells you about your fixed costs and your startup costs. So this was for Oakland. You know, I think it's pretty close, but this is a a hypothetical bank, so don't hold me to it. But this is all the utilities, the facilities maintenance, There's actually general liability. You have to pay about that for insurance premiums, $100,000. The staff, of course, you need a staff in a bank. I've got pretty minimal staff here, only 22 people. There is a president, there's no vice president, there's director of operations and another director of finance and technology. There's facility, there's service, security, HR, finance, and so forth. I didn't put the board of directors in here, but I assume they have to be paid too, so that might even be additional to this. But what all this comes out to is $2,330,800 in fixed costs per year. So whatever our bank is, it has to be able to cover these fixed costs. And also remember that everybody needs office space, so there's a total square footage of almost 1,000 square feet. So we're going to assume that the building is available, and because it's a government building, there is one savings here. You don't have to pay property taxes if you're in the government. So that's, you know, there's all these little savings when you have a public bank, and they kind of add up. The other thing is that, of course, you're not paying Jamie Dimon $20 million a year to run a bank. You're paying something much less. The president of the Bank of North Dakota makes $300,000 a year, just for a comparison. Oakland, I gave a little bit less, but that would be obviously the highest salary. Okay, so the building setup costs, we're assuming it's an owned space or a floor in a building, but you need renovation, you need a bank vault, you need certain security for a bank, and so that's startup cost. So that's almost $2 million right there. So we're going to need to take that out of the capital when we start up the bank. There's a whole bunch of footnotes here, which you don't have to read, but basically these are things that apply to a bank. The Bank of North Dakota is a $7 billion asset bank. They don't have any need for branches. This is another savings. Bank of North Dakota has one branch. It has a headquarters. What it does is it supports all the community banks, and they have all the branches, so they're paying for all that overhead. But because it has $7 billion in a state with 740,000 people, it can backstop all these community banks, and as a result, North Dakota has the highest per capita bank ratio to person in the country. It also has the lowest foreclosure rate. It has the second lowest unemployment rate, even after the crash in the oil prices. And in fact, the Bank of North Dakota just had another record year, which they've had for the last 10 years. Every year is a record in earnings, including the crisis of 2015 when the oil prices cratered and gas prices cratered and everything. So they came through it because they're actually investing locally. They're not doing, they're not drilling for oil or investing with Exxon or something. Those companies get their money elsewhere. So they're doing local loans. Okay, so this number in green is also going to be carried over into the return spreadsheet, which we're going to go to now, but not on this sheet. This is actually the sample sheet from Christopher Moore when he did this in 2003. So this is what I started with, and you can see that he made certain assumptions. The capital ratio has to be 8%, leverage ratio 3%, reserve ratio has to be 10%. I explain what these are down here a little bit. But in the appendix of the manual that's up on the slideshow, I explain much more, and I have actually his chapter in the appendix, and then I explain within the text itself. Return on equity is after-tax earnings times total equity. Return on assets is after-tax earnings divided by total assets. And I give the cell numbers, which of course means much more when you're actually on the spreadsheet. Okay, so that's the sample. And by the way, there's another website called Cafferman.com, CAFRMAN.com, that explains how to find the assets for any political entity, how to look it up. All these CAFRs are actually standardized now. So it doesn't matter if it's a city or a state or a county, they all basically look the same. And if you want to find the figures that will show you the assets, and even though they're hundreds of pages long, you don't need to read all of them, you only need to read like 2%. And you can find the assets that you need. Okay, so all right, past that. Okay, so now we go on to the actual worksheet. Now this is the one that I used to sample and I modified it. to make it easier to create an actual bank. So the green amounts over here are all taken from the capital. Remember I said it was $50 million, so if you add those three up, you get 50 million. And you see if this one is in italics, that actually comes from the previous worksheet. That's the 1.83 million. Everything on this sheet is in millions. So if you add that to the 5 million in cash and the 43.17 in reserves, you get your 50 million, and that's also up here. So we're taking 10% of the pension funds, remember from the previous sheet. Now we have deposits. So also in the CAFRs, they have something called general fund revenues. That in the case of Oakland, the total is 624 million. I'm taking for the first year, this is only year one, I'm taking 178 million, and of that, I'm dividing it into loans to banks, because a bank can actually loan to other banks, so that's 16 million, and then ordinary loans, 137 million, and I'm estimating the earnings. This should actually be 0.5, but anyway, the big one is really ordinary loans, it's 2.25. Now remember, this is a bank that lends through other banks. So even though it says ordinary loans, because that's what it said on Christopher Moore's. Because that's what it said on Christopher Moore's workbook. It's actually loans via other banks. So total assets for the bank are 203 million. And there's 25 million in common stock, so you add up all these orange figures and you get to 178. So we've got common stock, and it's a little bit of a misnomer because remember it's a public entity. It's actually technically a DBA, which means doing business as. So it's doing business as California, or as Oakland in this case. So technically the city of Oakland owns all the common stock, but we need it down there in order that the total equity is high enough that we can meet our capital ratios. So remember, the ratio minimums are all here. We're well above that in the first year. We don't have much in performance because we haven't made much money back from our lending portfolio yet. But that's going to go up, and so are the deposits as we go on. Okay, so next. So now we're into year 3. And so we've had 2 startup years when the bank was not that profitable. It takes a little while to lend out the money and start getting it back with interest. But now we're into year 3, so now we've got a little bit of retained earnings, 3.72 million. So we can decrease the common stock from that 25 million and plow it back into ordinary loans. And in addition to that, I'm taking more out of the total general fund revenues. So now I'm taking 400 million. And I'm dividing up into these orange categories here. So we have much more in the ordinary loans than we had in the other sheet on year 1. So now we're making 2.25% interest, and remember we're in a low interest environment. We're making 5.32 million. We've made a little bit off the banks themselves. We've made 0.62 million, added all up, 6.44. We've got total costs. Remember, we've got fixed costs every year, so 2.33, and there's a little bit of cost for maintaining an account, so I put that in too. That's 0.2, that's a subtraction. So anyway, the estimated net earnings are now 3.91 for year 3. Now, remember, we borrowed money basically from the pension fund, so they want something back. Obviously, the pension fund has to pay the pensioners. So the reality is the pension fund keeps about 95% of its pension year after year. They just roll it over and they make more money. So they pay out about 5%. Sometimes it's 4, sometimes it's 6. Depends on the market. If they start paying out 7, they start to panic. In fact, if it's 6, they start to panic because that means that they're paying out too fast. So we don't want that to happen, but what we're going to do is pay the pension fund back with dividends. And to do that, I should have mentioned also, all these figures in blue are figures that you enter. All the figures in black are calculated. The blue includes the things within the highlighted areas. Okay, so now we're doing the first year of dividends, and since we haven't done dividends in year 1 and 2, what happens is the calculation makes it look like it's going to take a long time to repay that 50 million. So it looks here like it's 34 years, but actually that's going to go way down as we go along. So that means that every year it pays a certain amount in dividends. It's paying 1.56 million this third year out of the three, which is the first year it's paying. And then it's starting to pay off the $50 million that was lent to it. Now actually it's actually an investment, so you're not really paying the capital, but just for reference purposes, it's good to know these things. All right, so this is the chart of the dividend payments as of year 8. So now you see that the first year it only paid 1.56 million, but then because the earnings are higher, because now we're getting money back from the loans, you could start ratcheting that up every year, and it starts to level off around year 8 or so. I didn't project beyond that, although if I did, it would still keep going up very slowly, but you'd be paying probably 4 million a year in dividends, versus 5% of the 50 million, which is 2.5 million. So you can see that by year 4, we're just about paying the same. Year 5, we're paying a little bit more out of the bank. So the bank is starting to turn a profit for the pension fund. And by year 16, it's actually breaking even. It's paid off more than the 50 million that it took from the pension fund, and everything else after that is gravy. So now the city is making money. It's making money where it couldn't before. It's investing in the community. It's got jobs created. It's got jobs in the bank, and it also has jobs in the banks that are supported by the bank. It's made all these loans, of course, which have started up businesses and helped people buy houses and so forth. So you've got all these great things going on, plus it's making money for the city. And actually it's making more than this, because I stopped at year 8. So again, you know, this would have gone up a little bit, so actually it might have paid off maybe in year 14 or something, if I, you know, increased it proportionally. All right, so that's that. Now we're into year 8. So in year 8, I'm taking 70% of the net earnings and I'm putting it into the dividends, so it's, like I said, 3.95. And now, if you look at the projection, it's going to project out to less than 16 years to repay the entire amount. That's what you saw on the previous slide. So the bank is solidly profitable. If you look at the operating ratios, they're all above the minimum. The performance is a bit misleading because, remember, we're taking 70% of the earnings out. Otherwise, if it wasn't for that, we would have, respectively, on the return on equity, we've had 19.2%, return on assets 1.32%, and if you remember, the sample worksheet that Christopher Moore had was pretty close to that, and he said that was a good return for a bank, and on the Bank of North Dakota, it's pretty close to that too. They've had about a 20% return on equity for about 10 years running, so we're pretty close to having those kind of performance metrics with the public bank, so it does work. So this is not the only way to do it, but it's certainly one way. And I started to do it for White Plains, which is a smaller entity than Oakland. So I did the same thing. I got the numbers, I got the investments. I had to do a little bit of more creative asset gathering because the pension fund really wasn't big enough. So I had to take a percentage of governmental funds and proprietary funds. Now that becomes a problem because they may need it back sooner than the pension fund. But I only took 11% of those, all three combined. So I'm hoping, and I'll find out later today, I'm hoping that it's possible to take a small percentage for a long time and not have the city miss it. Or, you know, White Plains can combine with Greenberg and then pool their assets, and then we make a bigger bank. The bigger the bank, the better this works. So I did New Hampshire recently, and that was terrific because they had like millions of dollars. And, you know, they paid it off in 10 years, and it worked out really well. They had all kinds of deposits and things. Oakland is a good-sized city. When you get below 100,000, it starts to get problematic, and White Plains is 57,000, except during the day when it's 225,000. But not everybody who comes in pays the taxes and you know, keeps the revenues up. So the actual resident population is 57,000. But it's a relatively rich city, so it's kind of borderline. Okay, so that's my presentation. Anybody have any questions?
What are
Not
So my question, I had two, I'll ask the second one first. The pension fund, is it only for public employees, or could employees of nonprofits and other businesses who would feel more comfortable with the security of a public bank say, we want to move our 401k into this public bank? Would that be a possibility?
Well, 401k, of course, is invested in stocks and bonds and things like that, so you wouldn't be putting that in a bank by definition, because it's literally invested in those markets.
But if they wanted to have like a retirement plan for employees, not in the private sector, but in a public bank?
Yeah, I mean, you could certainly figure out a way, I suppose, to create an account and put it into the public bank. Now, a public bank is an interesting thing because it's actually not open to the public usually. In other words, you don't walk in the door and create an account.
Right.
Bank of North Dakota has no ATMs, it has only one branch. It's basically a back office operation. But certainly if the charter was set up to allow other accounts to come in and combine them in some way, they could do that, yeah.
And then the other question was about Oakland. So is the city council in Oakland discussing starting a public
I
bank?
hope to find out in the next meeting. Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. I investigated the Bank of North Dakota a couple of years ago, and I believe you must be a resident or business in North Dakota to have an account there. Is that not true?
Yeah, I think the figure was 97% of the money is from the state of North Dakota in taxes, as Jane told you.
So my question would be, is there an established public bank that people in this room, if so inclined, could deposit their money and savings into?
Not at this time. There is a public bank in the Chippewa Nation in Oklahoma called Bank 2. Which does a similar thing to the Bank of North Dakota. It takes the money from the Indian Nation and puts it into a central bank and does all the lending and so forth. There's no public bank in this country beyond that on a national level or state level or city level. But there are 20 bills, or were 20 bills as of 2 years ago, according to the National Council of State Legislatures. So that was 20 bills in 15 states, so some states have more than one bill. We have a bill in New York State from Sandy Galiff's office, which is a feasibility study bill, and that's been out there for, I guess, 3 years now. Of course, it has to be reintroduced every year. And there's a Senate version, too, from James Sanders, who's in Brooklyn, which is a mirror image of the Assembly bill that Sandy introduced. I appeared with her, in fact, Nada and I both did, I guess, 5 years ago?
Was it that long ago?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
And in fact, in Westpac, in the other location. And then we went to Albany and we had a press conference as well. I think right now there's 10 co-sponsors. On the Senate side, there's 2, including my senator, who I convinced to co-sponsor the bill. And then James Sanders is the sponsor. We need many more. I mean, this is what we need. We need, 40, 50 co-sponsors of this bill just to get the feasibility study going. And that's I think, our best political option in this state right now. But, if Oakland is interested, if White Plains is interested or Westchester County is interested, that's another option. The Public Banking Institute is drilling down much more into the city and county level now and trying to make that work, so, yes.
Yes, I wanted to share this, and I don't want to offend any political party, but I have to say the truth as a witness in residential housing. We have a lot of people, Caucasians and minorities, Caucasians who are not happy with the bank that we have now. And they were talking, they have some meetings about having their own bank, some kind of bank that's local, just the one that's the way that you are presenting here. The problem is that there is many people who are not very happy with Sandy Galiff, because under her dominion and the Democratic Party, they have been subduing the minorities into shutting up and quiet them down. So we don't hear, we don't see, we don't talk. That's the way that we are living now. So we would like to have, in order for me to help, to be a volunteer and help the indigenous nations, I must have a representative in Aseni that has the trust of the community. Completely trust. So
Well-
they can work together maybe with Sandegal. So she doesn't have to be the only voice from us.
Yeah.
We wanted to have our own voice. That's my suggestion.
Well,
I'm very happy to go.
we worked,
And
I mean, I don't
then
want to, like, debate whether she's on our side or not, because the bill hasn't gotten far enough to find out. But we worked with Catherine McLaughlin, and she's the legislative aide who puts forward the bill, so she's...
Was.
Or was, maybe she's
Left,
gone.
retired.
Oh, okay. See how long ago this has been. But in this state, that's the only bill that we've had. Certainly we can have indigenous community, if they have enough money and they want to create a bank, there's no reason they can't do it either. When I come from New York City.
They need to know how.
Yeah, well, this
Just
is...
like we here.
This
We
is
don't know
why
how.
I did the spreadsheet, because you can actually plug the numbers in from any entity that has CAFRs, and you can find out how to do it.
in Albany, you can reach out to Annette Robinson. She is the chairman of the banking committee, which we also met her. She is from Brooklyn, and she is I
She's
think
black.
it's open, yeah.
Corey's been trying to say
Yeah.
something.
Oh, yeah.
So, how would you start, or what are the first steps on a county or city level?
Well, I mean, see your councilman, see your assembly member, bring some people with you. Learn about, before you go there, learn about public banking, maybe bring some brochures. You can go to the Public Banking Institute site, there's all kinds of stuff to download there. You can look up Ellen's blog, get on the Google group, there's a public banking Google group, which is pretty active, and we have lots of discussions. Every time she writes an article, she puts it there first for us to review. You can go look up public banking. I have a site on Facebook, two sites actually, for public banking. So you can get on there, and I put files up there you can download. You can download anything actually here today.
How long does it take, if you're to start it, if you're to get the okay go, how long would it take to actually be in?
It depends on how you do it. One suggestion that's been is to actually find a bank that's about to go bankrupt, and then for the state or the city to buy the license.
That's interesting.
And if they're already licensed, they can just take it over, and then you got your building and your facilities. So that saves some time. It might take as little as a year or a year and a half or so.
And I wanted to add, we could have a committee here. You could be the head of a small subcommittee.
I agree with you.
Excuse me one second, Gloria. Of some aspect of public banking. If you're, tuned in to do it, starting a public bank, but we could sign up here.
See, because it's a public bank, it has to be approved and authorized by either the municipal authority or the county authority. It's not just because we're excited about it, we start it ourselves. It's a public bank, which means it's owned by everybody who lives in that jurisdiction.
Another question,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Would the loans that a public bank would be able to issue, could they loan it out to like startups and tech companies?
Yeah, I guess I should talk about this a little more. A public bank is run like a regular bank. It has loan officers and a board of directors. In the case of North Dakota, there's a level above that, the governor, the attorney general, and the secretary of agriculture, because it's an agricultural state. But they don't make loan decisions. That it's not politicized that way, and you have to be careful that it doesn't become a slush fund, frankly, or an economic development corporation. That's a different entity. It's a bank, and they expect to make money back, and then the money gets put back into the entity that controls it, whether it's a city or state. But it's run like a bank.
So they can't just loan out as
The Bank of North Dakota has all kinds of programs for students, for small farmers, small businesses. They have loans as little as 1% because they want to support local businesses. Now there's caps on those, like they only loan $50,000 or something. When they had a flood in Grand Forks, they suspended collecting mortgage payments for 2 months.
Wow.
Imagine J.P. Morgan doing that, right? So, you know, if it's a state entity or a city entity, they're there to support the community. So they're going to do all of these things to make sure it works. Yeah.
Yeah, was kind of wondering how it worked. You seem to have the pension funds as the main asset here. Now in New York State, it's my understanding that there's a single pension fund for public employees for the whole state.
For the state, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's where I get my checks from every month. But I was wondering, since at the state level, how could a particular municipality use those funds as a starting asset?
That was my question.
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about, you know, White Plains or Westchester, then you would probably want to use the funds from those entities. If we're talking about New York State, then the pension fund is there, so.
Well, I
And
guess-
New York City, we could do the same thing. You know, the
Yeah,
pension
the
fund in New York
city
City
is its own, right.
is actually as big as the one from the state. They're both about 180 billion.
But I think that's what, if I understand it,
Yeah.
that's the rub, is that White Plains doesn't have its own pension fund. All its public employees have pensions through the state pension fund. So that's why, unless there's something that I don't know about, but most municipalities in New York State operate that way, so.
We have a
they would-
fiduciary fund, which, yeah, you're right, it may not be a pension fund, and it's a little bit small, that's why I had to go to other funds. But they have 2.5 million in the fiduciary fund. Then there's 27 million, or actually 28 million, almost 29, in the proprietary fund, and then about 96 million in the governmental funds. But remember, those last two are not long-term, so we have to be careful how we take money out of those. Yeah.
There must be political will. I mean, what type of leverage is required to get these politicians or city officials, public representatives, to back something like this? What is the incentive?
It's putting money in the community, it's diversification, it's, you know, a way of protecting the money. Let's suppose we have a crash again. You know, we had a crash in 2009, which reduced the New York State pension fund from 156 billion down to 110 billion. So you don't really want to have it, so it's diversification from that.
Speaking to that, I think that you might start with just making sure that your representative knows about the issue, because I know that Assemblymember Mayer did not, I mean, it was brought to our attention and she was happy to sign on. So I think sometimes it's not necessarily that they're unwilling. I'm sure there are some who are unwilling, but I think for some people it's like, wow, it's a great idea, let's get on board. And then my other question was whether or not you've had outreach with the comptroller's office, because I would suspect he would actually be, or he might be receptive, and then if you had that, then you might be able to.
I haven't spoken to Tom DiNapoli. I did speak to Scott Stringer when he was running for Comptroller of New York, and he said it was a good idea to get farther. And I've met with his staff a couple of times with other people, and they seemed enthused, but you know, it takes a lot of pushing. We have to get a populist support, and we have to keep it on their agenda.
But I just think if he endorsed the idea in spirit, then when you go to other people, then you have at least his, you know, somewhat of an endorsement or something, and then you can, it can snowball a bit, I guess.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Is it possible, oh, sorry. Is it possible for pensioners, say civil service pensioners, to have a committee and investigate where the money is going? I mean, why can't that be something
It's
civil
all public
service people
record.
could be doing?
And in fact, when you start to look at the pensions and what they're invested in, it's pretty scary in some cases, because I looked at New York State's pension fund. They're in 56 different currencies around the world.
Isn't it?
They're in bonds that go down to C rating, you know, there are not so many, but there are a few. Of course, they're in stocks, and we all know what they do when there's a crash. So, you know, to think that a public bank is more risky than that is a little bit straining for credibility. So a well-run bank should actually be a safer investment. And they have safe investments too. They have treasuries and so forth. So the public bank would fall somewhere between a U.S. Treasury, let's say, which is the safest thing, and maybe the stocks, and maybe the return on it would be in the middle somewhere.
From your experience, is there some pushback from financial institutions against this kind of?
There's a lot of pushback from commercial banks, especially the biggest ones. The smaller ones, it depends, because they may not know about it, or they're a little wary, but if you explain to them that there's actually more small banks in North Dakota than any other state per capita, and the reason is because of this bank that's basically saving them. And that 2,000 small community banks have gone out of business since the crisis in 2009, out of 8,000, and that they're basically going all kaput or being absorbed, and that there won't be any more small banks at this rate. Then they get interested.
And may I add that Ellen Brown, in her book, is worried that the pressure for the TPP will, in fact, has a provision to stop the Bank of North Dakota.
So that's why the TPP is dangerous for public banks, because it's considered unfair competition, as if the government is competition.
In terms of Westchester, what would be like an ideal place to establish the first public banking, or is it something that can like survive in any?
Ideal place is wherever people are most in favor of it,
It could be a
enthusiastic.
county level bank for Westchester County.
So where would that be located?
Probably White Plains, because it's the county seat.
I think you'd have trouble with the current political administration
I'm going to find out,
Westchester
meet
County.
the mayor and the city council.
Oh,
person.
White Plains is fine.
County
White Plains, I meant the county executive.
When we did some lobbying in Albany, I want to just to go back to Wally, we went on a day trip and we spoke to a lot of New York State Assembly people. We were told the governor has the authority to issue an executive order. Maybe, I don't know if he has the authority to issue an executive order to create the bank, but certainly to investigate the possibility of starting a New York State public bank.
Well, as some of you know, there is a green bank that Cuomo created, but it's, first of all, it's limited only to environmental lending. And second, it's a private-public partnership, which means they can't really lend until they get private money. And third, it's not using these kind of assets that I'm talking about in the chapter, so it's limited in size. I think it's still less than $1 billion, and they've been trying to ratchet it up, but for a state our size, that's not really that significant. So, there's all of these kind of compromise solutions. They did something in Vermont with the Treasurer's Fund. They expanded it, and it's sort of bank-like in a way, but they can't leverage their capital. They only have a fund, so they can lend to the fund and they wait to get paid back, then they lend it again, and that restricts the whole thing. You can leverage your capital in much, 9 times more, so you can lend much more money if you have a real bank.
Is the reason why a public bank would be more stable to economic up and downs because of the type of capital it's used to fund itself with?
The capital, the pension fund or fiduciary funds are there, and they've been there for decades, and they're not going away. That's more reliable than individual depositors. The Bank of North Dakota is actually not FDIC insured, which is actually a savings, another savings of money. And if you think about it, North Dakota has far more than $250,000 to deposit, so they would need much higher insurance than the FDIC is currently making, so there's no point in having FDIC insurance. They're basically the state guaranteeing itself.
Can a bank own stock in a company?
The Bank of North Dakota has some of that, not that much. It gets dangerous and perhaps not to the purpose of the bank to have too much of that. I think the actual loan portfolio is about $4.5 billion out of the $7.5 billion in assets, so the rest is in securitization and things like that, but or just some cash. But obviously for people, they want loans in the community, not outside investments. So these are things that in the charter you have to specify.
You can also state that no funds from this bank will be allowed to use the state and
Yeah.
make that part of the requirement. So there's none of that subprime mortgage nonsense that was partially responsible for triggering the crisis.
Yeah, as you know, the commercial banks securitize most of their loans, and this is why they don't pay that much attention to the quality, because it's off their books. So the Bank of North Dakota keeps almost everything on their own books, and so they are incentivized to make sure their loans are going to work.
Fred, you had a question?
I was wondering what the impact would be should the Glass-Steagall Act ever be reenacted. Would that benefit public banks in some way, or it's irrelevant?
It's not really relevant because the Bank of North Dakota was there when it was enacted and it's still there now. More significant is what Jane was saying with the TPP, or some other Federal Reserve action that makes them not eligible for the Federal Reserve discount window, for example. So that's the important thing, is to get your money as cheap as you can through the discount window.
Just only one suggestion, about this presentation is the first time in White Plains, right?
Yes.
No,
Can
you
well,
came before.
Can you put like the video that you did, the presentation, so
It's all up on SlideShare.
so we can send it to
So
Facebook?
you can circulate it.
That's
And
right.
I should also
Yeah, Dan
say,
Vivar, a lot of people watch Dan Vivar because he was like a mayor, he ran for mayor.
I also wrote a book. Public banking is covered in Chapter 3, the CAFRs are covered in Chapter 4, they work together because the CAFRs supply the public banks. Chapter 1 is what you all were kind of talking about before, monetary reform, Lincoln's greenbacks and that kind of thing. Chapter 2 is land value taxation, which is Henry George's idea. You add them all up and we have about $5 trillion more in the economy to play with.
What's the name of your book?
My book is America is Not Broke. It's up on Amazon.
Do you have copies with you?
I have 3 copies for
Yes,
sale at
he has
$20
3
each,
copies.
which
Okay,
is
well,
$10 cheaper than you'll find on Amazon.
Excuse me.
If anybody's interested.
The website that you use.
Oh, AmericaIsNotBroke.net is for my book. And Public Banking Institute.org is for them.
Is it available as Kindle?
Not anymore, it used to be.
Just before people break up, if anyone would like to work on promoting public banking, we should collect names if anyone wants to continue working on this.
I do.
Yeah? Okay, good. So Corey's one. Good, Nikki two. We have 2 and 3. Also,